Alright, we're moving on to Chapter 10, Part 2. You'll be finishing your Chapter 10 activities in your Boy Who Harnessed the Wind journal. I don't have it opened right now, but you should have it opened on your screen as I continue reading. I am picking up at the bottom here on this page, starting with "Of course." Of course I forbade my sisters from even entering my room to sweep and mop. I was certain they didn't appreciate the value of a used muffler clamp or water pump. Who knows what they might sweep into the dustbin? "But Mama told us to clean," they yelled through the door. "I'll tell you when it's time," I answered. "I'm busy." When I wasn't in the scrapyard, I hung out at the library or sat in my hammock and read. At this point, my father felt so bad about my schooling that he no longer forced me to work in the fields. This made my sisters jealous. "Why does William get to stay home and not us?" Doris asked my father one day. "Is it because he's a boy and we're girls? If he's staying home, so are we." "William has a project," my father said, "and if he's really wasting time, he'll be proven wrong eventually. You girls just worry about yourselves." With my father's blessing, I spent mornings and afternoons planning my windmill. I pored over chapters about electricity and explaining physics. I learned how it moves and behaves and how it can be harnessed. I reviewed sections on home wiring, parallel circuits versus series circuits, and more stuff on AC and DC currents. Back at the library, I renewed the same 3 books over and over until one day Miss Sicelo raised her eyebrow. "William, are you still preparing for exams? What are you up to?" "Just building something," I said. "You'll see." More and more, going to the scrapyard began to replace school in my mind. It was an environment where I learned something new each day. I'd see strange and foreign materials and try to imagine their use. One thing looked like an old compressor, or perhaps it was a landmine. I found real compressors and shook them to hear the pieces rattling inside. Then I would pry them open and investigate. My imagination was constantly at work. Sometimes I pretended to be a great mechanic crawling on my back under the rusted cars with the tall grass clutching me in its arms. I'd shout up to the customer, "Start it up, let's see how she sounds. Give it gas, don't be shy. Whoa, whoa, whoa! That's too much." If the engine didn't sound right, I'd give it to them straight. "Looks like you need an overhaul. I know, it's expensive, but that's life." I shouted to my other mechanics who were slacking as usual, "Feary, today you're doing oil changes." "Yes, boss." Another mechanic walked over, shaking his head. Problems again. "Mr. Kamkambwa, boss, we can't fix this car. We've tried everything, but it still makes a noise. What do you think?" "Start it up." Yes. Injector pump. "Thank you, sir, for sure." I climbed atop the tractors, pressed the ignition button with my foot, and pretended to drive. "Out of my way! Your man Kamkawamba must work." In my mind, I dug ridges in my field, making up for all the days I'd swung a hoe in the sun. Each time I wished one of those tractors would actually fire up and move. If it did, I dragged the whole scrapyard home. But no matter how much fun I had, my mood didn't last long. The students across the street at Kachukolo could see me banging away on various things. If I wasn't careful, they could even hear me talking to myself. A few times while carrying out my pieces, some kids in the playground cried, "Hey, look, it's William digging in the garbage again." The first time it happened, I walked over and tried explaining the windmill, but the kids just laughed. Even days when I tried sneaking past, something would spot me through the open window and shout, "There goes the crazy guy off to smoke his chamba." Chamba is marijuana. Luckily, I did have a few supporters, but Jeffrey had been hired by our uncle Masuali to work at the maize mill in Chipumba, and that meant that Gilbert was the only person I would trust. Finally, I decided that whenever someone shouted, "William, what are you doing in the garbage?" I'd just smile and say nothing. Of course, the students at Kachukolo told their parents about the lunatic in the scrapyard, and soon my mother was getting an earful in the trading center. Now, when I came home with my pieces, she stared at me and shook her head. One day, she barged into my room looking worried. "What's wrong with you?" she said. "Your friends don't behave this way. I mean, look at this room. It's like a madman's room. Only madmen collect garbage." That night, she complained to my father. "How is he ever going to find a wife like this? How is he going to care for a family?" "Leave the boy alone," my father said. "Let's see what he has up his sleeve." You can notice that William's dad really does believe in him and is encouraging him during all of this, and that he is definitely on to something. Over the next few weeks, the treasures kept revealing themselves like pieces of a magic puzzle. When I realized I needed more PVC, Gilbert allowed me to dig up the drainage pipe from the floor of his bathhouse. He didn't bother asking his father, who wasn't happy the next morning. Once the pipe was cleaned and dry, I cut it down the middle with my bow saw. I melted it over the fire until it bubbled and curled, then rolled it off and pounded it flat. I then cut 4 blades, each measuring 4 feet in length. I wanted to go ahead and connect the blades to my tractor fan, but I had no nuts and bolts. I spent the next 2 weeks in the scrapyard turning over every machine and piece of metal. But I only had a box end wrench, and that was too large for most of the bolts I found. Many were so rusted they stripped against the tool or refused to budge. I told this pathetic story to Gilbert one afternoon, and right away he offered to help. His father sometimes gave him money for working in their fields. That day, Gilbert walked to Mr. Dodd's shop with 50 kwacha and bought a sack full of screws, bolts, and nuts, all the perfect size for my windmill. I was so grateful. But I still had a problem. The metal pieces needed to be welded together to ensure they would hold. We had no welding machine at home, and to hire a welder cost more money. I was stalled again. Then one day in the trading center, I got lucky. I was playing bawa with some friends when a man pulled up in a dump truck. He was from Kasungu and needed boys to help load some wood. "I'll pay 200 kwacha for the job," he said. I ran over waving my arms. "I'll do it! I'll do it!" He motioned me into the truck bed along with 10 other guys. I spent all afternoon throwing logs under the sun, tired, sweaty, and with the biggest grin on my face. With 200 kwacha, I could pay a welder for the first phase of work, connecting the shock absorber shaft to the bicycle's bottom bracket. That way I could spin the crankset and chain and move the wheel. I also needed him to melt holes in the metal blades of the tractor fan so I could bolt the bigger PVC blades. Mr. Godsden's shop was in the trading center under the grass-covered shelter. He used an electric welding box, ancient-looking and made from wood, that plugged into the wall, and his home with a long patched-together cord. A crowd of people usually gathered around to watch him weld, myself included. The men would discuss the particular project while the boys played in the shower of sparks that shot from his gun. Even though I had money for the job, Godsden laughed when I walked up carrying my pieces. "You want me to weld a broken shock absorber to a bicycle with one wheel?" he asked, mocking me. Others in the crowd joined in. "Ah, look, the madman has come with his garbage. We've been hearing about you." He's not a man, just a lazy boy who plays with toys and refuses to work. He's Masila." That means crazy. My face grew hot. I was so tired of hearing those words. "That's right," I said. "I'm lazy, Masila, whatever you want to call me, but I have a plan and I know what I'm doing. Soon all of you will see." I then turned to Godsden and gave him the dead eye. "And to answer your question, mister," I said, "you heard me right. Weld the shock absorber to the bicycle and make sure it's not crooked." When Godsden was finished, I paid him my money and took the bicycle home. I returned it to its place in my room and started laughing. It really did look like a madman's creation. The shock absorber jutted from the crankset like a strange robotic arm, its joints fused with melted metal. Next to it, my blades leaned against the wall like giant insect wings, their white surfaces scorched and bubbled like a burned marshmallow. The tractor fan looked like a super Chinese throwing star, one that would slice through the darkness, leaving a trail of light. I couldn't wait to put them all together. But once again, I was missing something, and it was a big something. I needed a generator, but where in the world was I going to find such an expensive thing? I could wait and try to earn 500 kwacha to buy the dynamo in Dodd's shop, but that could take forever. The owner of the dry goods store had hired a permanent team of workers to unload his trucks, and jobs loading wood came only so often. So I went back to the scrapyard. I spent the next 3 weeks sifting through the grass like a bomb-sniffing dog, turning over every piece of metal in hopes of uncovering a generator I may have missed. Or at least an alternator. Hadn't I seen several of those? Well, it turned out that I wasn't the only one looking for such things. Some younger boys from the trading center had also discovered the importance of electric motors. But instead of using them for science, they were just stripping out the wire to build toy trucks. I caught them one day as I entered the yard. I shouted, "Hey you!" but they took off running. Maybe they'd heard stories about the madman and feared for their lives. Anyway, when I got to where they'd be standing, I found a perfectly good motor stripped of its wires. It lay there dead in the grass like one of those poached elephants missing its tusks. I began to fear my windmill would never get built. Worse, over the next month, it seemed like every dynamo in central Malawi came out to taunt me. I saw them on bicycles everywhere, and most of the time they were broken, not even attached to a bulb. I'd think, God, what a waste. Give it to me and I'll show you how to use it. Others worked perfectly and shot fat beams of light down the dark roads at night. I never had the courage to flag down the owners. What would I say? Instead, I woke up each morning to the pile of metal in my room, then went and helped my father in the fields. At night, the windmill pieces were easier to look at since everything disappeared in the dark. One Friday in July, Gilbert and I were walking home from the trading center, and I was feeling glum. "How's the windmill going?" he asked. "I have everything, but still no generator," I said. "If I had that, I could build it tomorrow. I'm afraid the dream will never come true." "Oh, sorry, friend." Just then, we saw a guy pushing his bike. I didn't know him, but he was around our age, and as he passed, I looked down and noticed a familiar glitter by his tire. "And look," I said, "another dynamo." But this time I wasn't afraid. I ran over to the guy and asked if I could see his bike. I bent down and gave the pedal a good spin, and when I did, the headlamp, an old car bulb, flickered on. Gilbert turned to him. "How much to buy the dynamo?" he asked. "No, Gilbert," I said, "I don't have any—" "How much?" Gilbert said again. The guy refused at first, but finally gave in. No one was foolish enough to refuse money at this time. 200 kwacha, he said, with the bulb. "I still have some money from my father," Gilbert told me. "Let's use it to buy the dynamo. Let's finish the windmill." He reached into his pocket and pulled out 200 kwacha, 2 red paper notes. After some messing around to get the dynamo and bulb off the bike, I was holding them in my hand. "Sekomo kwa mambiri, Gilbert," I said. "Thank you very much. You're the greatest friend I've ever had." While Gilbert went home, I ran back to my room and placed the dynamo with the other materials, adding the last piece of the puzzle. The moment I laid it down, a magnificent gust of wind blew open my door and spun a cyclone into the room. It whipped up the windmill pieces in its arms and revealed the finished machine, its blades spinning wildly through the blur of red dust. Or maybe that was only a dream. And that is where Chapter 10 ends. It sounds like William is going to get somewhere with his windmill after all. So finish your Chapter 10 activity in your journal, and then you will submit your journal, and I'll be checking it for your Chapter 9 and 10 activities.